Perfect. Okay, so as I mentioned, we are very pleased to have Leonard Basobas here with us. He's currently Director of Growth and Development for the Emergency Medicine Clinical Research Unit at Stanford, of course, and he has over 20 years of experience in the field of clinical research. He was a senior research manager at Stanford Center for Clinical Research. So he is one of our former colleagues and the study lead, a senior project manager at various other academic institutions, contract research organization, and large healthcare systems, as well as private sectors. Leonard has extensive experience successfully building and managing cross-functional teams and training and developing staff in accordance with good clinical practice and federal regulations. So thank you so much, Leonard, for your time and expertise, for being here. Please take it over.
Thanks, Susan. And I'll go ahead and share my slides. And I'm sure, as you guys knew, like when you first signed up, I mean, this course is going to take into account, like a quick question, can everyone see that the slides? You just pop into the
not yet. We don't
yet.
See the slides yet.
Now 1 second. Let me just get this shared. Okay. How about now?
We see it. Yeah, now perfect.
Is that better for everybody?
Yes, when you go on slide mode, that's okay. Perfect. Yes, thank you.
Great. Just some ground rules early on, guys. Good morning to everybody. If you can, want to try to make this as interactive as possible. When we look at the actual agenda and or our objectives today, in the next slide, you'll actually see that, we're going to discuss various scenarios or a couple of scenarios here at the end. So there's not a lot of in previous workshops that you probably attended, especially from the virtual side, there's not going to be a lot of breakout rooms or things of that nature, because a lot of this material, quite frankly, is kind of dense. Okay. So for me, Susan's going to be there to actively moderate the chat and throw out any questions. Feel free for any of you to come off mute if you have a question as we go down the road of looking at not only the regulations but some of the policies here at Stanford. For all of you that probably have taken any courses through Spectrum, especially when they've done things, especially those hands-on workshops with regard to good documentation practices, there's going to be a lot of redundancies here, guys, just to let you know, because obviously, as we start to navigate this space, especially for those who have been in clinical research for quite some time, as we start navigating the space from, transitioning from paper to fully, quote unquote, electronic, there's that hybrid part in between that I think, even the FDA is, they're still, even though they have a regulation, and we'll talk about that a little later as far as 21 CRF Part 11 that deals with electronic records and documents and also signatures. But to that extent, they're still crafting and or the guidance and or the guidances, as you'll see later, that really give some practical, quote unquote, utility to those actual regulations. Okay. So, again, feel free as we move forward, jump in the chat, come off mute, show your face on camera if need be, because I'll actually start, asking some questions throughout as well. Okay. Any questions so far before we really get into this? Okay. Great. Sue. Okay. So what are our objectives today? So we're going to talk about the importance of good documentation practices. There's going to be a little refresher on the regulations and the guidance. We're also going to look at some of the definitions that are prescribed in ICH and obviously look at some practical applications as well. Then we're going to get kind of into the heart of this, discussion and or this topic when we talk about electronic documents and data. when we discussed 21 CRF Part 11, okay? And at the end, time permitting, and hopefully we will have time permitting, because I don't think I'm going to be able to sit here and just obviously talk at you for about an hour and a half. So again, hopefully we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. We've got a couple of scenarios here and even a bonus one, just to make sure that all of you guys kind of clearly understand what Part 11 is about. And, for some of those elements, especially when we start dealing with electronic documents, how to handle those. Okay. Okay. So obviously, if you've been in clinical research, and I'm sure you've heard this, and especially with, the good documentation practice, course that's given by Spectrum, what's the importance of good documentation practices? Well, it's that old axiom, especially in clinical research, where if it's not documented, then it hasn't been done. Okay. So that's what we're really honing in on. Again, there's going to be a lot of overlap, especially when we start talking about electronic documents. Now, what's interesting as we start to navigate and kind of move into this world where we're using more and more electronic signatures, electronic documentation, electronic systems, quite frankly, there's a mode as far as obviously, tracking and authenticating that type of data these days, right? So absolutely. So, just pay attention. And if you use this old axiom here, you can carry it forward into electronic documents as well. Okay. So for me and how I like to teach certain things, and I'll let everybody know, I'm sure my staff and former colleagues know this well of me. I really like to try to emphasize, especially if you're a coordinator out there, I like to really try to emphasize the regulations, right? Because if you look at the regulations, especially when they're, FDA regulations or you're working on an FDA regulated study, a lot of that, quite frankly, when you look at the Code of Federal Regulations, that's the law. Okay. And we'll make sure to point that out, and we'll have a little refresher here. But for me, when I look at good documentation practices and even electronic documents and data, I'd like to actually start backwards. Okay. And so for me, it's not necessarily to scare you guys this early in the morning on a Monday, but usually, the reason why we start looking at good documentation practices, especially when it pertains to electronic, documents and data, is because there's still some compliance issues out there. Okay. If you look at this list, and this is just a small list here of some of the common compliance issues, and this is according to the FDA. Okay. Now, where can you guys find this? I guarantee if you guys Google right now and look at quote unquote like compliance issues, on the FDA website, you will be taken to a landing page that basically has some audit findings for a lot of their clinical research or FDA regulated studies. And you can look at these, and they publish these actually annually. Now, that being said, if you look at these that are listed here, some of these obviously, are more prevalent than others. The order often changes if you were to rank them, depending upon the year and or the types of audits that were being conducted. So, when you look at this, it's what's interesting to me and always has been for the last, couple of decades, is most of the things that you see here often just switch in rank order. They're common as we move forward. And again, it just goes to show you that, even in this world whereby, we have these very prescribed laws, these guidances, that, it's still being conducted by humans, right? We're still having this human element, not only from our staff, but also from the patients, right? So there's always going to be, and just want to make sure that everyone clearly understands this as well, okay? None of you guys are robots, okay? We're not looking at you from a clinical research coordinator standpoint, or staff members. You guys aren't robots, even though we're moving through these electronic systems these days. There's going to be some errors, and it's okay, guys, because coming from the monitoring world, that's anticipated. Okay, what we want to try to do is just minimize and or mitigate a lot of those issues that might obviously come through as we try to look at the regulations, but also try to interpret these specific elements that are, again, mostly black and white. But as you guys know, like in the real world, when you're putting these black and white words into practice, some of them just don't fit. okay? So that's kind of, where I'm starting here, really looking at from a compliance issue standpoint, okay? Because, I kind of borrowed this slide that was shown. Again, this is more of a spectrum slide and a CRQ slide, just to show you, like, okay, according to Stanford, you saw that list there from what was going on with the FDA, right? Well, here's kind of a percentage just based on some of the audits and the internal audits that CRQ has done here at Stanford, right? And if you look, basically down below here, as far as good documentation practice, is about 8%, right? But take a look at just the left in those green areas, document management, inaccurate or complete records. If you look at that pie chart, that actually encompasses a lot, okay? I mean, that's all related really to documents, okay? So, I mean, almost half of this, even like essential source documents, not available. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So now that we know why we're here, and really like going down the road of, again, electronic documents and data, I just wanted to do a little refresher here on the regulations and guidance. And this is, again, where it kind of get heavy, but I'm going to try to like pare some of this down and just hopefully speak to you guys more in terms of, how you can take some of these messages away. And obviously, the way I like to teach this, looking at it from the perspective that all of these are kind of like intertwined, okay? This kind of reminds me of a lot of subjects that when I was, in college and or in grad school, and not necessarily related to clinical research, but more along the lines of like looking at a lot of the sciences, right? There's no easy jumping off point, especially for these topics, meaning that a lot of these are intertwined and or they depend on some of these other topics to better understand them, okay? So the conversation usually is circular. It just depends where on that circle you choose to jump in on, okay? But knowing that it's a circle, you kind of have to keep going around and around to, quote unquote, start to piece the puzzle together so you get a full and more in-depth understanding and grasp on what you're trying to do here, okay? For me, and again, from a lot of our staff, former staff, current staff right now that are on the line, when you look at the regs, right? It's important because the regs and the guidance, they give you the reason why you're doing what you're doing, okay? I just don't want all of us, to sit here and kind of like understand the specific task, okay, for which you were hired in for. And now, again, trying to implement and not having a clear understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. Okay. So as we go down the road of actually refreshing, this slide for me has sadly enough, carried forward for me for the last 15 to 20 years, okay? It's a little Venn diagram just to show you, how a lot of these regs and guidances kind of interact, okay? And what, quote unquote, for us, we need to follow, right? Because we'll throw out at you, and I think, in past workshops, we've thrown at you, 21 part, 312 or 812 when we start talking about, investigational product, whether it relates to drug and or devices, respectively. But most of those are FDA regulated studies, right? And I think the common question for a lot of people, especially when you start to look at the regs, well, yes, that's the law, right? And it relates to FDA regulated studies. But what if I'm doing an investigator initiated study that doesn't fall under FDA regulations, right? So, do I have to follow those prescribed laws / regulations and or guidance, right? So that's often, where we start to look a little bit deeper. And as you look at this Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of information that comes out, not only from those FDA, Code of Federal Regulations, which again, just to be mindful and just to keep circling back, that's the law, but also ICH, right? And as if you guys are following that closely, maybe not so much, ICH is where, good clinical practice is defined. Now, has that been incorporated into the FDA regs lately? Absolutely. So therefore, we have this little Venn diagram. But as you look here in the middle and even, to a lesser extent, the bottom here, you can see there's going to be a lot of overlap with our own IRB and or, a single IRB, but also sometimes the sponsor SOPs. And also what we here in California, even from a local perspective, as you kind of keep drilling down, not only what we're doing from a national perspective, but now local to California, but even local to Stanford. Okay. And even if your department has even written their own SOPs and now has, quote unquote, made them aligned with, say, Stanford's SOPs or a sponsor's SOPs, if there are little nuances or the way that your department likes to deal with certain things, oftentimes you need to drill down and really try to find out, okay, what's most applicable to me and or to our study. So it's oftentimes, looking at this Venn diagram and really considering like, okay, I've got these huge overarching laws and or guidances, okay, but keep drilling down, as we'll kind of do today, and kind of look at it from a practical standpoint, like what's relevant to me, okay? What's relevant to Stanford, because that's the environment that I'm working in. Okay. Any questions, comments right now? Okay. And again, just be mindful, guys. Again, if you have any questions, go ahead and, feel free to plop them in the chat, and or just come off mute, okay? Because again, this is very dense material as well. Just want to make sure that you guys have a clear understanding as we move forward. So, going back to good documentation practices, okay? And again, just mindful, again, it's a circular conversation. There's going to be a lot of elements here that kind of apply, right? So the Code of Federal Regulations, ICH, what are Stanford's policies? What about a sponsor if we're dealing with that, right? This is a circular conversation. Wherever you jump in, you're going to need to understand how, say, for example, if we look at ICH at the very top circle there, right? I mean, that is ICH E6R2 right now. And as we look at that, well, how does that interact with all the other elements? Okay. All right. So as we delve in here, again, just a refresher, Code of Federal Regulations, okay? These are the requirements for conducting clinical studies and or clinical investigations, and it outlines the responsibilities for the sponsor, investigator, and the IRB, okay? For conducting these clinical studies involving human subjects, okay? It's the law, okay? So when you look at those, documents that are online right now, just be mindful that it's the law. That being said, now, is it like from an enforceable standpoint, when you look at those, say, for example, when we look at, 2150.25, and we're looking at, really trying to identify, well, okay, what's required in the informed consent? And all of a sudden, you see those basic requirements, those 8 elements there, and you see, multiple others that are just optional. Well, what if my consent doesn't have one of these required elements here? Am I breaking the law? Absolutely not, right? There are going to be certain points there that if you provide justification, and that's why we have our IRBs to review those elements, because they're going to, quote unquote, hold you accountable for justifying why that element's there. There may simply be, a really good justification for why that required element is not there. So, just, I guess, circle back, have open conversations with, your people who are in charge and or providing oversight to your clinical studies, whether that be the IRB and or even CRQ, Spectrum, your department, your managers, things of that nature. Okay. Okay. So here's some federal regulations to know. And as from the agenda, as you saw, we're going to really talk about, electronic records and electronic signatures today. So 21 CRF Part 11. But I'm sure you guys know, if you've taken your city training and or, just maybe have like an interest here in the regs as well. I mean, these are some of the other ones that you need to know. Okay, protection of human subjects, understanding financial disclosures. Part 56 really deals with IRBs, right? And how they navigate, quote unquote, every single study. and the two big ones, right, when we start looking at investigational products. So 312 and 812, okay, for drugs and devices. Any questions so far? Okay. Now, you're going to see some of these slides. They are going to be rather dense. I'm not going to read them to you, okay? I'll merely point out, obviously, the regs and or, the reference to where these are being pulled out. But, the importance for, at least for this slide, right, is to really show you that, okay, this is coming from the Code of Federal Regulations and pertaining to drug studies. But as you see here, just in the couple elements that I've highlighted, there's a reason and their importance here, again, of good documentation practice, right? Because as we go down in this clinical investigation, case report forms, supporting data, what we're really truly talking about here now, again, is documentation and source documents, right, that are going to be needed and provided for, authentication, not only for, and verification, not only of your data, but also the individuals that are being involved. Okay. So for me, when I look at this slide, yeah, don't worry about the density and the language here, but more along the lines that clearly understand that, okay, this is why we're doing what we're doing here. And again, since it's a Code of Federal Regulations, it's the law. Okay. So when we take a look at ICH guidelines, right, specifically what we're looking at here is, E-CRU. And I won't belabor a point. I don't believe I have another slide here that describes what R2 is, but I'll definitely can speak to it. But ICH guidelines, right, they're for good clinical practice, and they were published in 1997, okay? So it was a long time, but if you truly understand, the reasons why ICH was published to begin with, it was basically to help facilitate some type of standardization for various countries that were participating in these clinical investigations that related to drug, okay? So that was the main point of it. They wanted to try to create some standardization across the board. So therefore, they can help facilitate, drugs to market a lot quicker. So right now, GCP is an FDA guideline. Okay, it doesn't have the force of law as we saw for our Code of Federal Regulations. But now, if you see there in that second bullet point there, should any guideline conflict with the law or regulation, right? The law and or, oops, sorry. Let me go back here. Okay. The law or regulation is always the rule. Okay. So this ICH guideline, E6, is really separated out in multiple sections, but the ones that are going to be most relevant to us today, as we looked at our definitions, there's a glossary of terms. Okay. We're really going to go down the road today and just really speak to, some of these definitions that, again, pertain to electronic documents and data. Because they're going to be relevant to you guys. And if you have a clear understanding, just even of those simple definitions, it's really going to help you guys out as you move forward and give you the understanding and the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. Okay. Obviously, there's section 4 and 5 that deal with investigator and sponsors. What's interesting to me, every single time I look at that, if you guys are participating in any study whereby it's investigator led and or it falls under the Code of Federal Regulations or FDA regulated study, at times, investigator can actually act like the sponsor. So do the guidelines now, if that person is an investigator sponsor, both sections apply to that individual. Okay. So just be mindful of that. And so understanding now the interaction and or interplay with section 4 and 5. Section 8 is usually helpful for everybody across the board, especially when you start looking at your own documents, what's relevant when you look at your regulatory binders, right? This really describes the essential documents for the conduct of a clinical trial. Now, that being said, as we start getting into part 11, there's going to be a, minor discussion here of how do we do that? Because everything used to be paper-based. Now, well, what happens now when we start moving over things to the cloud or Box or things of that nature? Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, now, as you can see here, again, we're just giving you a little bit more of the why. I know you've probably seen a lot of this information when we start to talk about Alcoa. We'll talk about that a little later as well, okay? Now, when you see, obviously to the left, when you see, 4.9.0, those elements, again, since there's no CFR or parts there attached to it, we're referring back to the ICH document E-CRU, okay? So as you can see here, and again, this is just a refresher, just talking about source data, right? And again, here follows along the lines of Alcoa, right? Has to be attributable, has to be legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete, okay? Changes to source data should be traceable, okay? And the reason, why that's like, I won't say necessarily new and or that language is in there is because here we go, we're starting to like bleed into quote unquote, now looking at electronic systems and electronic documents, okay? And so they should not obscure the original entry. And you guys saw, in that workshop as well about GDP, they give you a very prescribed way of how to correct information, right? And or data that you captured if it's incorrect. Basically with that simple line through, not obscuring that previous information there, but obviously signing and dating it, right? Or initialing dating it. So here, like, I guess the question for me that often gets raised, especially when we start talking about systems, well, how do we do that here in an electronic data capture system, all right? And as you can see there from the parenthetical, looking at an audit trail at that juncture, okay? So it's incumbent upon, in this section, again, section 4, which deals with the investigator, it's incumbent upon the investigator to make sure all of those elements, all the data that is being captured is actually accurate, complete, legible, okay? And obviously contemporaneous, all right? So all of the information here in the data that's captured on your case report forms that are derived from some type of source, whether that be Epic and or merely a piece of paper where you first capture that information, okay, should be consistent, okay? And if it's not, like obviously, if there's any discrepancies within the data from the source and what's written on those worksheets and or case report forms, obviously you need to provide some type of explanation or justification of why there's a difference, okay? Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay, as we continue here, again, providing you a little bit more of the reasons why, we're still in section 4, talking about the investigator, right? So as we mentioned earlier, if there's any change or correction to a CRF, obviously dated, initialed, and explained. So obviously they show you how to correct that. Most of that pertains to written, but as you can see here, just from that highlighted text here, okay, it applies to both written and electronic changes and corrections, okay? And so here, as again, in 5.18.4, we're talking about quote unquote the sponsor responsibility now, okay? Because oftentimes, I think if you guys have been in, outside of REDCap, which we use obviously here at Stanford for a lot of our investigator initiated studies, if you guys have been part of an industry sponsored study and or a study that actually has like an external quote unquote third party and or some type of sponsor, if you're looking at an electronic data capture system or EDC, those are going to be most relevant obviously to the sponsor responsibilities. All right. And obviously, so 4.9.4, we as an investigator or an institution should maintain these documents as specified, right, in essential documents for the conduct of a trial or all of section 8. So just a show of hands for a lot of folks here, how many people have actually gone out and looked at, ICH E-CRU? Again, just feel free to pop your name in the chat if you guys have actually looked at that document ever. Okay. Nice. All right. So as we move forward here, again, just with our objectives, we're going to start talking about in the glossary. That's section 1 of ICH when we start really looking at the definition of practical applications. Okay, so these are just common definitions. Again, this is not like this is external, not in ICH E6R2, but it's important, I think, to really carve out a distinction here between what people consider records and or documents. Okay, now documents in general are approved instructions, right, either on paper or electronic, that guide how an activity should be executed. Okay, versus records, where now records are essentially those elements that provide evidence that the activity has been performed or results have been achieved. So a record can be considered a document. Okay, so if you guys just keep that in the back of your minds as we start to talk about documents and records, especially that last point there, that a record can be considered a document, because as we start looking at, again, electronic documents and records, that's going to be most relevant. All right, so what about documentation? Again, this is basically straight out of ICH E6R2. Again, in the glossary section, in the glossary section, 1.22. So documentation is all records in any form, right? There we go. Including but not limited to written, electronic, magnetic, optical, and scans, x-rays, and electrocardiograms that describe or record the methods, conduct, and or results of a trial, the factors affecting a trial, and the actions taken. Okay. What about source data? Okay, again, really speaks towards all information in original records and certified copies. And as we go down the road, again, quick show of hands, how many of you have participated in a clinical investigation that had to deal with certified copies? Just a quick show of hands. Okay. All right. Looks like a handful of individuals. That's great. Okay, and so we'll talk about that and get into definition of certified copies as well. Interestingly enough, we're currently doing one right now in emergency medicine that hasn't been a little bit onerous, because that type of documentation obviously, right, is in this hybrid mold or mode, whereby it clearly identifies like where that company is. With regard to like clearly moving over from paper into the electronic mediums, which they have, but to the extent where have they utilized them in that capacity? Not really. So what we're looking at, again, from this perspective and this definition, right? All of this is being tracked, and or it's the original source, right? In the original records and or a certified copy, right? So as far as the definition here, I mean, it really substantiates, the existence of the patients, and also substantiates the integrity of any of the trial data. So as we go down deeper, a little bit more into source data or data, it's found in your source documents. Okay, so here's your source documents where data is first recorded on a clinical trial. Okay, this data is then transferred to a CRF, which is paper or electronic. Okay, so we'll get into one of the scenarios here a little later that absolutely happened in real time at our institution, and hopefully you guys will have obviously the correct answers for this. And as we talk about, again, source data a little bit more, here's just a couple of examples. Okay, as you can see here, obviously, medical history, examinations, things of that nature. Any questions on that so far? Yeah, great. So as we start, speaking towards, and again, this is probably relevant, and you guys have probably seen this in the past when we're talking about, good documentation practice, especially in that, workshop given by Spectrum. So a lot of people, and this is obviously a very common question, especially when we started dealing with a lot of these hybrid studies that captured a lot of information on paper, but also, needed to be transferred into an EDC. So at times, you know, there was always a question, well, is this paper CRF that we're utilizing, is it actually source? And or is it just merely a worksheet, right? So say, for example, I mean, classic, you know, example here, and maybe I'll hold that until we get down a little bit later, but, you know, worksheet may be provided, right, to assist in the collection and organization of data and transfer, okay? So what's the standard? Source data is always the first place, right? That data is written down, but a worksheet data may be either copied from the source or may be used to capture the original data, which in that case, if it's used to capture the original data, okay, now does that make that worksheet source? Anybody? Chat? Any affirmatives and or? Okay, yep, there you go. A lot of answers, yes, absolutely. Because if the standard is the first place and you use your worksheet to capture that, then absolutely that now becomes your source document, okay? So as you can see there, from that standard and from this little table, first place where data or data is written or captured, and so that can be transcribed, right, from the source to the worksheet. It's always original, okay, can be used to record original data. This would be considered source at that juncture, right? So the answer was there all along. Okay. So again, you've seen this, and we just spoke a little bit about this, especially when we talked about the definition. Again, this is Alcoa plus principles. And again, this is going to be most relevant. And just be mindful, guys. You know, the attributable, the contemporary, you know, like, again, whether legibility is actually a concern now that we start, quote unquote, typing things in and start dealing with electronic systems. You know, but attributable, contemporaneous, accurate, you know, complete, are going to be the things that we're really going to hone in on, especially when you start moving and transitioning more and more into electronic media. Okay. Now, obviously, this when we start verifying source data, like obviously supports any of the entries in there, right, and provides confidence in the reported data. And you'll often hear, you know, a lot of monitors and or, you know, auditors talk about verification of source data, or SDV. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about source data. Now, what about source document? Okay, this is again straight from the definition in ICH E6R2 when we're talking about original documents, data, and records. Okay. And as you can see here, they give a laundry list here, and we'll dig into that a little bit later. But as you also see here, I mean, you know, source documents are essentially essential documents, right? So I think that's going to be an important, again, take-home point as we move forward in this discussion. All right, so here's some examples, just like source data. Here's some source documents that you guys are probably very familiar with. You know, clinical and office charts, lab notes, subject diaries, or evaluation checklists. Those are going to be important as we move forward as well. Radiographs. Any questions, comments, concerns? Great. Okay. Now, again, by the show of hands, I think there was only like a handful of people when we really talked about like certified copy. Now, here we go. I mean, for this definition, it really, really defines it really well, right? I mean, it's a copy, okay? Irrespective of the type of media used of the original record that has been verified by a dated signature or by generation through a validated process. To have the same information, including, okay, here, data that describe the context, content, and structure as the original. Okay, so what we're merely doing for those individuals, and again, for some of those individuals that have never worked on a study that required certified copies, this literally is now a point, right, of where you are actually printing out source. Say, for example, if you needed to, quote unquote, capture like lab values, okay, from Epic. So this is actually printing those elements out. But what's interesting is, like, you know, you'll see an audit trail, and you actually can see that at the bottom of like when you actually printed that information out, say for a monitor or for a sponsor. You can clearly see that that there's an audit trail. You can see who the user who printed it out and on what date. Now, for a certified copy, at times, will that be, acceptable by the sponsor? At times, yes. Okay. For some others, they will actually make you, quote unquote, like sign and date it. Okay. And therefore, you are validating for them that this piece of paper that I just signed off on, and or now whether we created it in electronic media, that certified copy that's signed and dated, actually you are validating that, yes, this is an exact replica, right? Or a certified copy of the original. So that all that information that they see on that piece of paper, now they're taking it to heart to say, well, if I looked in Epic, that exact same, or all those exact same values, and there that test, the dates that were where when it was done, should be identical. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. And a very simple definition, right? I mean, again, it's important. I think this term obviously is thrown around a lot, especially nowadays when we start talking about electronic documents and records, and we start talking about EDCs, an audit trail, right? Documentation that allows reconstruction of the course of events. So if with anybody who's obviously worked in with an EDC in the past or currently, right? There's a well-defined audit trail. And the reason being is because, this is kind of amounts to what we were discussing earlier on how to make corrections, right? So essentially, as you look at the audit trail, we're really looking at, okay, why the changes were made, who actually made those changes, and or are they valid now? So we're always trying to authenticate whatever changes are being made. But also now by that audit trail, we can clearly see, rather than just that line through, initially and dating it, you can actually see who actually did all that stuff in the electronic system now. Okay. Okay. So question in the chat. So when it comes to electronic certification, okay, is it considered a certified copy if the signature and date is typed? Okay, I'll leave that up to quote unquote the chat and or the rest of the group here. What do you guys think? And feel free to pop your answers in the chat. Or come off mute if you're so inclined.
We have a couple of answers in the chat. A yes, and Jennifer is saying if it is done through an approved system like Adobe Sign. Yeah. Everybody, please feel free to unmute as well if you would like. Another answer is not only if through an approved system, Adobe Sign. Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, that's yep. Yeah, very similar answers, everybody. So that's really good. Yeah, so again, recall, like now, again, not only an approved, and we'll start talking about, not only an approved, but more, again, when we're talking about electronic documents, data, and also systems, for which, again, there's a lot of, I won't say necessarily ambiguity, but a lot of discussion in or around, like, well, what construes? And so I think that was a really good question that came across when we're talking about electronic signatures, right? Because you're absolutely right. I mean, here, if you do have an approved / now we're going to use the correct terminology here, right? A validated system. Okay. Because now there's obviously a couple elements here that require, like, if you're going to go down the road of actually getting a system validated, that need to be in place. And yes, approved is the correct term as well, but more along the lines of really like honing in on validation of an electronic system. So that being said, and we'll get into one of our bonus scenarios too, when we kind of discuss electronic signature and or a handwritten signature, especially when it comes to electronic media. Okay. So in this case, Again, if it's through a validated system and you actually do just type your name in there for that signature and it's validated, then yes, that's actually correct, right? So it could be considered, a valid signature at that point in time. Okay. Any questions, concern, comments on that?
I have a comment, Leonard. This is
Yep.
Sue Swope.
Hi, Sue.
So hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. So if you print off from Epic, a big, say, batch of medical records or lab results, I think that your name and the date is on every page. And so I have been told in the past that you don't have to stamp it, you don't have to put your signature on it or anything like that. Is that true?
Yeah, Sue. I mean, so we'll always use the golden rule of quote unquote answering, especially in clinical research, right? It depends.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of sponsors that obviously accept that. There's obviously other sponsors. And again, I'm pointing really to one of our sponsors that we're currently undertaking this study. They don't care about that, right? Or they hadn't. They really want us to actually certify it, like certify it in an extent where they want us to sign and date all the quote unquote pages.
Wow.
So yes, it's been laborious. So I wish, and I think there is traction with that sponsor now to say, well, you can clearly see that you can see who printed this out, and it's a person that's on the delegation log and the date that they printed out. And right now there has been some discussion with that sponsor to really now hone in and say, well, yeah, that actually does merit a certified copy, because there's no way, quote unquote, that this is just there or has been entered, that that's just quote unquote like been inputted there, right? So PEG brings up a good point, right? SHC policy, it states that copies are considered certified. So that's always something, Sue, that you can actually take back to your sponsor too, just in case they want you to be that very deliberate to go actually have you sign and date things.
Okay, thanks,
Okay.
Leonard.
Yep. And thanks, Peg, for that. Okay. So as we move forward, again, this is the example that we all used, previously, right? As far as a validated system. So here we go. Look, in validation is, it's a process. It can obviously at times be a little bit laborious, oftentimes undertaken by whoever owns that computerized system, right? It's a process of establishing and documenting that the specified requirements of a computerized system can be consistently fulfilled from design until decommissioning of the system or transition to a new system, right? The approach to validation should be based on risk assessment that takes into consideration the intended use of the system and the potential of the system to affect human subject protection and reliability of the trial, right? So again, our practical example that we threw out there is like basically Stanford's validation of Adobe Sign, right? So that we can utilize it to that's capacity. And probably some of you guys are probably asking, well, what was included in there, right? Because Adobe Sign has always existed, but now how do we validate it, quote unquote, for use, especially for clinical trials. And part of that validation, process, right, is ensuring that we're able to, quote unquote, like store and or archive those documents now that are signed electronically. And that's just one piece. Okay. Any comments, questions, concern on that? All right, so we've gone over a lot of our definitions here, and in some of the practical applications. Now we're going to get into 21 CRF Part 11. Okay, now this is going to seem a lot of dense for a lot of folks, including myself, right? Because I grew up in the world, quote unquote, when I first started out, almost every single trial was done on paper, right? And as I've seen this transition that we've gone from hybrid to now fully electronic, systems and or electronic data capture, at times straight into the EDC versus capturing any other place, right? So that source now is considered the EDC. But as you can see here, there's a lot of difficulty, especially when we start getting into our scenarios here, that, wow, I don't know if that's even acceptable at this juncture, right? So I would say a lot of ambiguity, but when we really dig into Part 11, okay, and as we see, like again, I'll go over these slides. What's interesting to me is that not only is there like a Code of Federal Regulation, right, that describes electronic documents, records, and signatures, but to the extent there's actually quote unquote two guidances out there right now. And one reason being, when we start to look at the new guidance and or draft guidance that's out there, and it just came out recently, I think in March of this year. And part of that was based on a lot of not necessarily pushback, but a lot of feedback from sponsors, investigators on how to interpret Part 11, right? I think ever since Part 11 came out, there's always been a lot of room for, again, interpretation, because, a lot of people, as these systems came on board, weren't necessarily sure how to navigate them. Some people thought the FDA's, use and or like what and how they prescribe what was written in Part 11 was probably a little bit too narrow of a scope, and even from the enforcement side. So there's been a lot of feedback, in 2003, but also, most recently, that they came out with a bunch of different questions and clarifications with regard to how to look at electronic documents and data. Okay. So what is Part 11? Okay, it describes here from this definition, electronic records, electronic signatures, and handwritten signatures executed to electronic records, and are considered trustworthy, reliable, and generally equivalent to paper records and handwritten signatures executed on paper. Okay. And just be mindful, guys, when we start talking about, especially this one last bullet point here, handwritten signatures. We'll get into that a little bit later on, and hopefully be able to provide you some clarity on, okay, is that signature an electronic signature or a handwritten signature? Okay. So this applies to records in electronic form that are created, modified, and now maintained, archived, retrieved, or transmitted under any records requirements of the FDA. Okay. And again, this last bullet point is going to be really important as we start digging in, especially when we talk about the predicate rule that FDA has with regard to, and what you guys need to pay attention to, whether, okay, does this fall under FDA guidance, or would the FDA like this to fall under their guidance and or oversight? Okay. So there are some additional controls, okay, like correction of data, obviously in data entry software. If a correction made on a case report form occurs after the data, protection of electronic data to prevent unauthorized access, and backup of electronic data routinely, okay? So those are some of the other elements that we'll talk about when we talk about Part 11. All right. So let's get into a little bit about e-signatures, okay? It's unique to the individual, should never be assigned to anyone else, right? So you need to basically employ at least two distinct identification components. Usually, a user ID or password. Ensure the uniqueness of the ensure the uniqueness of the identification component so that no two combinations are the same, and ensure username and password issuances are periodically checked, recalled, and revised. Okay, and I think for anybody who works with electronic systems in the past, obviously these are pretty much standard things for you guys, right? That obviously you need to use your own, not share it with anybody else, but also obviously, based on good clinical practice, right? That oftentimes they will ask you to keep on revising or changing your password, things of that nature. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, just in some of the talking points, there is a guidance for industry that came out from the FDA that really spoke to, in 2003. And it was basically at that point in time, and again, whenever you hear about guidances, right? And we kind of talked through this a little bit early on in this discussion. Often when you ever see the word guidance, right, it's often the FDA's current thinking. Okay. And for this one, they wanted to really provide based on a lot of, conversations, discussions when they first came out with Part 11, really want to provide, the scope and application of what, and how Part 11 should be applied, right, to electronic records and signatures. Now, what's interesting, again, just in this year, again, this was based on a lot of feedback from, industry sponsors, especially investigators as well, because they, as these systems evolve, and again, I think that's kind of a good thing, as these systems evolve, like, they want to provide some recommendations regarding the requirements, right, of, okay, how are we identifying or how are we applying what we see in Part 11, like that black and white section in the CRF, like, how do we ensure that all these electronic records, systems, signatures to be trustworthy, reliable, and generally equivalent, right? So that draft guidance, and I'm lobbying all of you guys to just Google it and try to find that guidance, because it's written more along the lines of a question and answer type of guidance, right? Whereby a lot of people had questions like, okay, and we'll get into one of the scenarios here soon. Well, is quote unquote, when somebody uses their stylus, and you guys don't have to answer this now because it's actually one of the scenarios, when like a physician or a PI uses a stylus and or their finger, on a trackpad and or a mouse, right, and uses that to handwrite a signature, in an electronic document, is that considered an electronic signature or a handwritten signature at that juncture? Okay. Again, keep that in the back of your minds and or pocket, so to speak, because the answer will be forthcoming. Okay. All right. So as far as this current thinking in these guidances, right? It's obviously these, FDA is very, very, very prescriptive. I mean, these are included in these introductions, right? For both of those guidances. That's, obviously not the law. It is essentially a guidance. So it's just their current thinking, right? So you'll probably see, especially like, in both of these documents, you'll see this quote unquote, this nomenclature calling these predicate rules, right? So a good rule of thumb, right? When you kind of look at the predicate rule that the FDA has, it basically mandates what records must be maintained, the content of the records, whether signatures are required, and how long records must be maintained, right? So if there is no FDA requirement that a particular record be created or retained, right, then Part 11 most likely does not apply to the record. So again, as we start honing in on the definitions here, what FDA is really looking at, and again, just a good rule of thumb on whether these predicate rules that we see like defined up top here, again, we're really concerned about the creation and or the retention here. So therefore, some of the information in Part 11, again, if it's not, then those don't necessarily apply to those records at that juncture. Okay. All right. So if we look into this draft guidance a little bit more, and again, there's a lot there. I just pulled out some and highlighted some elements here. And it's really interesting, that we have this guidance now. And again, based on a lot of feedback, because the FDA recognizes them just based on, these bullet points here, and you guys can read them for yourselves. Because, ICH E6R2 is very much, the revision happened. I know they're revising and coming out with an R3 as well. Reason being is because when we look at this, right, there's been advances, obviously, in technology, electronic systems, the use of them, since that initial guidance came out, right? That was 20 years ago. So as you see these systems, all this technology get more and more advanced. I mean, the biggest thing right now everyone's talking about is like ChatGPT, right? That type of information, capabilities, right, of electronic systems, all of those things. Again, the revisions that were, for GCP, a lot of them incorporated, new or addendums to certain sections because of this evolving world of electronic systems, right? So very similarly, Part 11, even though it was intended to describe, electronic systems and documents and signatures, even that needed a revision and or quote unquote a guidance to start describing a little bit more like what the true intent was as these systems evolve. So, you know, when we talk about like, and people ask me a lot about like, oh, Part 11 electronic signature, I always go back to it depends, right? That standard answer in clinical research, because guess what, guys, as these systems start to evolve more, technologies start to evolve, everyone's going to start pushing them. Well, we're going to start finding out, and there's going to be new elements here that we haven't even thought about yet, right? So as we move, there's probably not going to be one necessarily prescriptive rule and law. We're going to have to interpret this as we move forward. Okay. But as I mentioned, you know, early on, you know, that's what these guidances are there for, right? They're really to provide you guys with some current thinking and how, you know, getting a coalition, so to speak, of individuals in the room to really figure out, okay, what's most practical, what's most relevant. Okay. So a couple other elements there as we look in that new draft guidance, right? Again, this isn't necessarily new. I just want to point this out because this is when you look at ICH, you know, E-CRU, especially in section 4 when we talk about investigators, okay, personnel, especially when we talk about Part 11, you can see that the 3 elements here that we often prescribe to our own investigators, right? Education, training, and experience. Okay, so just make sure that any personnel that you're attaching, especially on these studies, and they're using these electronic systems and or capturing, you know, any type of electronic data and or now creating and or trying to retain specific documents electronically, right? They need those 3 elements. Make sure these individuals, you guys, especially if you guys are coordinators, you know, you're qualified by education, training, and experience, right, to perform those specific tasks. Okay. Another interesting point there too about the draft guidance, and I think a lot of these questions come across as well. Well, is it merely just, you know, what's captured there, or what about the metadata, right? So again, knowing when we're providing, you know, certified copies or paper copies of electronic records, right, associated metadata should be included, right? So there you go. When we talked about earlier, right, and knowing that SHC has that policy right now, a date and timestamp, right, for when it was acquired. So absolutely. Now, again, that's identifying them as a certified copy, right? So make sure, you know, that, again, that was a point of, or interesting point to me as well. So here's a couple of other elements here as far as like, you know, in that guidance, like, you know, with regard to sponsors, clinical investigators and other, you know, regulated entities, right? We're really trying, again, based on Part 11, right, ensuring the authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality of the data, right? Very similarly, not only are we doing that, but now we have to quote unquote ensure that the processes and procedures that are in place to safeguard all of those elements, the authenticity, integrity, and confidentiality of records. So I think it's important, again, just, you know, if you consider this like really good clinical practice, you know, this really ensures in honing in on, again, the responsibilities that a sponsor and or an investigator must undertake. Okay. And as we talked about earlier, you know, as far as audit trails, I mean, this is a little bit of redundant information here, provides a means to verify, right, the quality, authenticity, and integrity of the data. So these audit trails must capture electronic record activities, so including all changes. So again, when we discussed earlier on, like as far as just from a good documentation practice of just lining through, you know, dating it and initialing it, you know, that's what the audit trail is there for, especially when we start talking about electronic systems. Okay. So as in the remaining time, and I'll leave this open for discussion. And again, we'll probably get out of here a little bit early if we don't have a lot of, let's say, interaction or whatnot, and or any questions, but I'll leave you guys a really good, you know, some time here to just, you know, any Q&A that you might have with regard to, you know, e-documents and or e-signatures. But let's discuss a couple of scenarios. Some of these are true to life, okay? happen at our institution. Okay. So here's very, very simple one, right? CRC writes down a blood pressure value on a piece of paper or a worksheet. Okay. And I think we've answered this, but feel free to pop your answers in the chat or come off mute. Is that piece of paper considered a source document at this juncture? All right. Great, guys. Yep, a lot of yeses. So that's perfect. And it absolutely is at that juncture. Okay. So let's talk about scenario number 2. Okay, so this is where we start crossing these borders and or these lines where, okay, capturing data electronically. Okay, so the sponsor, requested direct data entry into the EDC. Okay, there was a study nurse that completed the data entry 3 days after the visit. Okay. Now, my question, and again, for a lot of people, was, is that data entry completed according to good documentation practice? And if not, what are some of the compliance issues? And if you can, again, plop this in the chat. But if anyone's more forthcoming that wants to come off mute and would love to answer that question, let's have a little bit of a discussion on this one, because this actually happened. So let's answer that first question. Yep. Carlos hit it right on the head. There you go. Yeah, it's not contemporaneous. So according to that electronic data, right, when we're talking about authenticity, right, and validity of that data, like it was not written down anywhere. So how could you really trust that data?
If you wrote it down beforehand on a piece of paper and then entered it into the EDC, wouldn't that count as like getting around that compliance issue? If
Yeah.
you also signed and dated it, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you go back to a lot of, our talking points, right, from this entire discussion. Absolutely, because at least you'd have some source documentation. In this scenario, there wasn't. Yeah, because they followed this straight request of entering data into the EDC, and they didn't capture it anywhere. There were worksheets provided, and literally just worksheets provided. And I think initially that entire study team didn't utilize the worksheets at all for the study. So yes, that was data that was entered, and you could see from the audit trail clearly it was entered 3 days after the visit occurred. And Michelle, you bring up a really good point. What about capturing in the EPIC note and in those elements? Absolutely. What was interesting about this study as well, that they weren't utilizing EPIC. A lot of the lab values and things of that nature were just captured point of care. So just right there in real time, a lot of that information for that specific study was captured right then and there. There wasn't any quote unquote cross utilization of EPIC at that point in time, because this was more like, again, straight quote unquote trial. A lot of the data was captured at the point of contact. And this is one of our early COVID studies and not necessarily entered in EPIC whatsoever. So some of these patients/participants came directly to the study versus actually going or having that mechanism where they actually came through SHC and or some clinic or hospital. So it's a really good question though. So Peg, just substantiate a lot of your talking points, guys, and a lot of your answers. So, great comment there. If written in the protocol and approved by the IRB, direct data capture into an EDC is allowable. Okay, it's permissible, but as long as it's contemporaneous. And again, that was our biggest issue there. It wasn't captured in a timely fashion. Yeah, so Sue has a really good question. So if the sponsor expects it, direct data entry, is there a time limit for data entry? Yeah, this is where we really hone in, Sue, and again, for all of you guys, like it needs to be, based on, Alcoa, it needs to be captured contemporaneously, right? Especially if it's entered, it's almost to the point where, you might almost have, and again, we talk about mitigating and or minimizing some of these compliance issues, right? It may be a two-person type of thing where somebody may be actually taking that blood pressure, but there may be a coordinator who's sitting in front of a laptop on a workstation, and actually, basically the clinical team and our clinical care team is kind of barking out what they're getting, and someone is actually just typing it straight in, right? So yes, I think it's important, again, unless you guys are utilizing what we mentioned early on, some type of worksheet to really capture that and then transfer it. Then obviously, since you do have source, then those timeframes by which you need to enter data, especially from a sponsor, usually at times they'll say within 24 to 48 hours, right, of the visit that they want the data into the EDC, then those would actually be acceptable, and or those requirements would actually be fulfilled at that juncture. But if it's straight data entry, then we need to ensure that it's done contemporaneously. But great questions and comments all the way around, guys. Okay, so here's my last scenario, and we'll end on this note. And again, I already alluded to this earlier on, right? So is this signature considered an e-signature, electronic signature? Love to hear your guys' talking points on this one. Okay. So a lot of yeses so far. Electronic. Good question. Is it a verified system? Yes, it is. It's a validated system. Is there an audit trail? Yes. Okay. All right, guys. So no, this is a really good question, and feel free to come off if you guys want to have a discussion. So when we talk about like handwritten signatures, right, regardless of whether it's captured electronically like that, using your finger like on a trackpad to actually capture your signature, right, or a mouse or whatever, that is considered a handwritten signature. Okay, so that by that straight definition, and if you guys look at this, the guidance that came out in March of 2023, right, it's very, very prescriptive. FDA's ruling and or answer, like basically, is that signature considered electronic signature? It's no, period, and then the explanation, right? So no, it is not. So it's interesting, and I think I've had the benefit of actually being in a startup whereby, we had to justify capturing electronic signatures or handwritten signatures, especially when we're trying to make sure that, okay, verifying that somebody signed off on an informed consent, right? So our talking point always, especially to FDA when we're trying to get this approved, is it's considered a handwritten signature on an electronic medium, right? So absolutely. So that's what we're really talking about. So anytime you use, your finger or whatever, that's considered a handwritten signature. It's just captured on an electronic medium. Okay. Now, electronic signature in this case, true electronic signature, right? Especially in a validated system, that can obviously, be typed as long as you have all those parameters in or around that signature that verify that, you authenticated that you were the individual signing off on it, had a date to it, things of that nature, right? And that's where we get into, that's that part of like, quote unquote, having a validated system. Questions, comments, concerns? Otherwise, that's pretty much it. And I'm actually surprised I stuck close to the hour and a half.
Thank you so much, Leonard. This was very informative and useful. Appreciate it. And please, everyone, feel free to unmute if you have any questions or put it in the chats. I also put the evaluation link in the chat, and I will also email it to you. So I'm gonna maybe stop recording, or does anyone have any questions? Maybe we could keep the questions in the recording as well. If not, I will go stop recording.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Right. In your opinion, Leonard, because you did mention that the good clinical, good documentation practices, there's the sponsor requirements, and then there's the GCP requirements, like ICH and FDA. But not all the time. We don't need to follow. Okay, hold up. Sorry, I'm still formulating the thought.
Yeah, no worries.
So should we be following the strictest guidelines? For example, if the sponsor doesn't necessarily require the certified copies and they're totally fine with just sending it without our verified signatures and dates, should we still go ahead and do that and send it to them anyway, in your opinion?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, a great question, actually. So, if we go back in here, let me just plop out of this real quick, and let's go back to that Venn diagram, right? I think this is where, when we really get into the heart and to that question or answering, right, it's going to depend. And yes, I think, when we kind of look at this and why it's this Venn diagram, for me, like I said, it's traveled with me for quite some time. It's because you kind of have to keep drilling down, right? Because there's going to be certain elements here. For example, I mean, is there, even going back to Sue's question with regard to, is there a time frame for that data entry, especially when it's, direct data entry? If there's any obviously prescribed elements, whether it be from our own institution and or a sponsor's SOP that they require, yes, contemporaneously, and or if there's a 24 to 48 hour thing, right? It's following those. It's really looking at what are the most applicable regulations and or guidance that are closest to you, meaning when we start drilling down on local / national type of things, right? A really good example of that, just within our own regulatory confines, especially when we start dealing, quote unquote, with our state, right? There's the California Bill of Rights, right? Now, if you look at that or consider the California Bill of Rights is someone, quote unquote, verifying that, yes, they clearly understood what they're participating in. All my questions have been answered. Now, is that quote unquote considered documentation of the informed consent process, right? In most other institutions outside of California, you would have to be very, very prescriptive in writing some type of epic note that really described how the informed consent process was conducted, right? And I think that's still a really good rule of thumb. But I know there's been a lot of discussion in or around when you start looking at that California Bill of Rights, because every single thing that you would document in an epic note is already there, right? And therefore, by that patient or that, LAR, which again, I know a lot of our talking points, and just as this is a little aside, right, where when we talk about legally authorized representative, and I know the new nomenclature, right, is legally acceptable representative for LAR. So yes, if someone signed off on that, the California Bill of Rights, is that suffice, or does that suffice for quote unquote documentation of the informed consent process? So that's why, again, that standard answer, if it depends, you really need to start honing in on, what's quote unquote used locally and or closest to where the investigation is occurring. Because as I mentioned, California, at least to my knowledge, and again, guys, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we're the only state that actually has that Bill of Rights. Okay. Olivia had a question. To confirm a signature via stylus or a mouse on a consent form from an FDA regulated study is considered a handwritten. And is that a question, Olivia, or is that sorry?
Yeah.
I think this goes back to your
So yes,
a bonus scenario. She's just confirming whether it's acceptable as a signature or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So Yes, that is, it's very much like, think about like the paper, right? Say, for example, whether it be anybody who's indigent or, lacks the skill sets to like, again, obviously write their own name. So when you think about that, as long as, again, it's legible, and or even where people have like utilized in the past, just like putting an X where their signature is. Yes. So it's considered a handwritten signature regardless. And it's just I won't say the nomenclature or the justification around that. It's a handwritten signature on an electronic medium, right? So good practical example of that, right, is when, say, you go to the bank, or when you're at, quote unquote, like, a grocery store or whatnot, and all of a sudden they require your sign off, to just like that little keypad, or at times where, we've utilized this for informed consents as well, whereby, people have been able to use their iPhones, just turn it sideways, as long as they have that signature bar, just like capturing it in a bank, right? Signing it with your finger, things of that nature. Yeah, that's considered a handwritten signature.
My understanding is that type is not acceptable. So if it's typed up, if they type up their name, that's not acceptable. And actually they have, I believe, blocked that option on Adobe Sign. I believe you cannot even type up. So
yeah, for like consents, absolutely. Yep.
But
Yeah, and that's, go ahead.
Sorry to follow up on that. I mean, for FDA regulated studies, we don't use a regular Adobe Sign when you actually, can sign, but with your mouse or stylus. We use the Part 11 compliant one. That's why I'm a bit confused, because then why do you need to use the Part 11, Adobe Sign if you can use just a stylus or, mouse signature on the documents?
Yeah, no. So yeah, hopefully I'll, haven't created more confusion for you, but more along the lines of, yes, if it is being utilized, it has to be Part 11 compliant, right? Meaning that system has to be validated at that juncture. So that's when we're talking about stylus or mouse or things of that nature, it has to be through that system. So for example, when you have the option here, when you look at Adobe Sign, right, it'll give you a couple of options, right, where you can either type it in, and or now there's a tab there where you draw it in, right? So that drawn signature is considered handwritten versus e-signature, right? So there's a differentiation there within that, and within that validated system, whereby if you draw it, that's a handwritten signature, versus if you just went there and captured it, from by the normal means, just typing it in, that would be considered an electronic signature or equivalent then. Does that make sense?
Not sure yet. Sorry.
Yeah, happy to keep discussing, if you want. Like, yeah, I won't say there's nuance there for sure, but yes, you need to make sure, again, if we're utilizing, especially for consent, that system is valid, right? It's Part 11 compliant, and validated as well.
I have a question, Leonard. Is there guidance from FDA or Stanford or elsewhere about the degree to which research interventions and research documentation needs to be go back the other direction into the patient's chart in EPIC, let's say? Just kind of, I've heard different things about what needs to be in EPIC versus what can just live in binders in our research space.
Yeah, it's a good question, Daniel. And again, at times depends. There are, guidances and or policies out there. I mean, I think the one that comes to mind, right, and I think we're referring to this as far as, say, the informed consent document, right, whereby I know as far as practice, right, is necessarily to clearly identify whether somebody is actually part of a research study. Therefore, it's best practice, right, to quote unquote scan that signed informed consent document and now submit it so it can be uploaded to the EPIC record. Okay. So that for me is one scenario and or one example of capturing that research information and now putting it back into quote unquote like the clinical record. Does that make sense? Now, what's interesting, and again, why I often hinge or go back, and again, this is not necessarily a cop out, but more along the lines of like using that same talking point, right? As far as it depends, right? Because some institutions will obviously really prescribe that's the mode that we need to go into. We do have, I'm gonna say, some constraints with what we're doing on the adult side for sure. I know oncology and peds have like the EPIC research module whereby, it feels like, a little bit more seamless, meaning that, research individuals being able to enter their own notes, progress notes, and or even to the juncture where patients are more readily identifiable that they're participating in a research study. But yes, I think right now, one of our good quote unquote like common / good practices especially when we're talking about like collaboration amongst different departments, groups, units within SHC, for example, like the laboratory, local labs and things of that nature. So they can clearly see, and again, by you uploading that informed consent into the EPIC chart now, being able to have some visibility and really now verifying or / validating that this person was enrolled in a study, right? So that's where I think there's that, I would say, cross functionality or like that interaction or interplay with how we capture things from a research side now going back into the medical record.
Thanks, Leonard. I know we are at the hour or even past, but there is one more question. If you would like to answer that, Jennifer is asking whether the pre-saved signature on Adobe is accepted as a handwritten, or does it have to be new signature every time?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So like according to that element, again, if it was hand drawn, and again, use a mouse, again, this is where I wouldn't say necessarily deferring to that element, but yes, it would still be considered handwritten because you use quote unquote that mouse stylus to capture that in the first place. But again, for me, that really is kind of a depends type of thing scenario, Jennifer, because I'll have to take a look, again, being mindful, I'll take a look at the regs a little bit closer. And again, if anything just supersedes my answer, what I just told you, I will contact you and let you know, and or the rest of the group, because I think that's a really interesting scenario, because you're right. If it's already captured previously, but again, honing back, if it was captured initially, kind of like source documentation, right? If it was captured initially via handwritten mode, then I would consider that handwritten signature.
And very quickly, Leonard,
Yes.
if this will also apply for PIs whose administrators have saved their signature as well?
So that's where I think it gets tricky, because now, especially when you talk about some of the PIs, right? Oftentimes those administrator, I mean, that clearly now comes across as quote unquote like a PDF, right? Or a PNG or a JPEG file, which for me now, considering that, whether that is truly captured, because again, now we're talking about the different parameters, and going back to that question, whether now if it's inside a validated system and capturing that signature and or not, because now here we do have, it's not what we consider like authentic and or traceable at that juncture, right? It's just a PNG file and or a JPEG file that's just being shared, right? So it's more like an image versus an actual signature at that juncture.
Exactly, LV, that is exactly the situation that I was thinking about when I asked my question. So thank you for clarifying it.
Absolutely. So yeah, I wouldn't hone in on that. I mean, I think over the past 4 or 5 years, like, through this entire COVID thing, we've had to send back multiple documents to investigators because that's exactly what their admins did, right? They just copied and pasted like that signature. Again, that's why you have those validated systems, because, you know, when you look at Adobe Sign, right, whether it be handwritten or typed, you can clearly see the authentication of when that occurred, and now that audit trail of like when that signature was captured, right? In those cases, absolutely, you can't.
Thank
And
you so much. Oh,
very quick question. So for recap signatures, since it's not validated with, and it's not compliant with 21 CFR Part 11, so we should not, if the study is a FDA regulated study, we should not use recap to obtain signatures then?
Yeah, well, here's the thing, right? I mean, it really depends on which REDCap instance you utilize, right? So our local one isn't quote unquote validated, right? But if you utilize REDCap Cloud now, that is Part 11 compliant, right? So it's a good question. So that's why I think, you know, and this is where, again, now we have this transition of like what type of EDCs we're using and things of that nature. I think for me, when I first rolled on here to Stanford, the true intent for obviously having a REDCap and a local version of it was really trying to like lessen the burden of conducting a lot of investigator-initiated studies, especially whether they're more in the observational space, didn't have any type of FDA regulation on top of it, and therefore we could capture signatures and or consents through that system fairly easily, right? So lessen the burden of that. That being said, yes, if there's any type of like regulatory oversight, then we're going to defer to those entities like an FDA regulated studies. And believe me, if it is a FDA regulated study and we're looking to quote unquote get a drug or a device approved, then you better believe they're going to ask for a validated system.
thank you so much, Leonard. We are sorry to hold you behind the hour, but we really appreciate your expertise and this engaging presentation. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for your participation and making this a very interactive class. Thank you. And we'll see you hopefully in our follow-up on our upcoming classes. Thanks again, Leonard. Really appreciate it. I'm going to stop recording now.
Take care.
Have a nice rest of the day.